Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you are allowing your faith to shape your politics or you allowing your politics to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. Our four guests for today will be Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We have Ms. Carmela Monk-Crawford, the editor of Message Magazine. We have Melissa Reid, who's the Washington Liaison for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the World Church of the Seventh-day Adventists. We're great to have you guys here with us today, and we're going to go ahead and jump right into segment one. Segment one is talking about fairness for all. You know, there seems to be this piece of legislation that is counter to the legislation on the Equality Act that we seem to be moving forward on and wondering if it is a better piece of legislation as it relates to church activities, church organizations, and just the betterment of society as a whole. Bettina, could you tell us a little bit about FFA and what exactly it's all about and why we think it's a great idea?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, Orlin, there is another piece of legislation that's kicking around Congress at the moment, which is the Equality Act, which proposes comprehensive non-discrimination protections for members of the LGBT community, which, of course, you know, is a worthwhile endeavor. However, there are a few issues with that piece of legislation. And so the Fairness for All Act is basically an attempt to bring all the stakeholders to the table and to look at the issues and say, what are your non-negotiables? You know, what do you need to have protected? Can we find common ground? And so the Fairness for All Act is the outcome of a years-long effort to sort of hammer out those issues of how to protect religious freedom on one hand and how to protect the rights of members of the LGBTQ community.
So, Melissa, the idea that we're trying to figure out how to balance one side of the aisle with the other side of the aisle and the talk of maybe they can all come together and agree on a piece of legislation, it almost sounds like fantasy talk that we're talking here. Is there a real possibility that Washington can come together on this type of legislation? What have you been seeing? And just help me understand.
Sure. Well, you know, we look at this, you know, unfortunately from the world that we're in right now and the sort of partisan environment that we see in Congress. But that said, I think absolutely yes. I think that there is opportunity. We've had some really productive conversations with both members of Congress and their staff, but also other partner organizations who recognize, again, as Bettina said, that you can, you know, and should be able to protect rights of both people of faith and also LGBTQ members, community members. And so, yeah, I think the fact that we have been able to share our concerns with how the Equality Act is currently drafted, right, you know, from a religious perspective, but also be able to share, you know, we very much want to, you know, we think that it's important that members of the LGBT community are able to, you know, are not be unfairly discriminated against in the workplace, in public accommodations, in housing, and things like that.
Right. But Jennifer, in order to make some legislation move, you actually have to have a few people who are supporting you in some way. Is there any key people in Congress that are really helping with this legislation? And if they are, do we really think that we have the chance of maybe seeing anything happen in this current Congress?
Well, I mean, who can say what will happen in our current Congress? But yes, we do have some key supporters. For example, Congressman Stewart is one of the key proponents of this legislation. And I want to go back to something that Melissa mentioned. Even though we're in this very partisan atmosphere at the current moment, we do have actually a success story showing where we can protect both those of religious liberty, but also the LGBTQ community. And that's seen in the legislation that passed in Utah. So we do have an example of two sides coming together to make something work to protect both interests.
So, Carmela, I got to ask you this. We've got the interests of the LGBTQ community, and we have the interests really of what we would call religious organizations. And it seems as though everybody would like to look out for each other's interests. Is there a way for these two groups to peacefully coexist and possibly get on the same page? I think it sounds good in theory, but what have you been seeing, and, what's your thoughts on it?
Oh, I absolutely. You used the word fantasy a few moments ago. That's exactly what I was thinking to myself. This is a fantasy. It would be amazing to see how this would work. But obviously, as Ms. Woods has said, it is happening some places. There are people who are able to make it work. What has to work is at the ground, the sidewalk level where you and I walk on a day-to-day basis. How can I make sure that the people around me have the basic things that they need in life and are able to live a happy and fulfilling life because I'm a person of faith? Does that cancel that out for someone else? I think this is where we have to do that introspection for ourselves, because regardless of what happens with this in Congress, regardless of whatever legislation is going to come, people of faith have to be able to answer for themselves. When somebody comes into my shop, how am I going to treat them? If somebody is a neighbor of mine, or we live in the same apartment building, or we work together, they need insurance, I need insurance. These are questions we have to ask for ourselves. How am I going to be? So, yeah, I can't say what it's going to be in Congress. I can only say what it's going to be for me and how I need to inform that for me and the people around me.
Jennifer, that's a good point, that this is really about how do we get people thinking about things differently. The idea that we have a community that, be honest, the LGBTQ community thinks that the church and religious organizations are hostile to them. But yet they have some real concerns from a discrimination standpoint. So is there a way for us to be able to look at this, even from a church perspective, to say, I understand your pain, however, please try to understand mine as well?
Right. And I think that that's where the tension really comes in. I think for many people, they think that it's an either or. It's, well, if I give these rights of non-discrimination to the LGBTQ community, then that means something's being taken away from me. And that's just really not how this should be framed. And we need to understand as well, as people of faith, many of our beliefs are not popular in society today, but those beliefs still need to have protection. And so I think that that's what, Fairness for All is allowing for, again, both groups to be protected. Now, is everyone getting everything that they want out of this legislation? No, but I think people are getting most of what they want, and this is compromise. And I think that, that's what this bill is really trying to achieve here.
Well, Bettina, it sounds to me like compromise is really the order of the day. The LGBTQ community would like to see certain things happen, but if they don't get this legislation passed with Fairness for All, then they've got a status quo situation that may be more problematic than anything else. How do we try to figure out the best way moving forward? Because I'm thinking getting something done is more important even for our groups and religious groups, because we don't know what it may look like 5 years from now if we try to get something moving forward, if we find ourselves remaining status quo. Help me understand that. What are your thoughts on that?
Right, sure. And in many situations around civil rights issues, we're happy to leave it to the courts to define exceptions and to set the parameters for outcomes in specific situations. But here we have this opportunity to define those ahead of time, to get ahead of the very uncertain terrain which a court may define sometime in the future. This is an opportunity to get ahead of the curve for all of the parties who are affected by these laws to come together and to realize that, contrary to what the culture wars tell us and how they condition us, this is not a zero-sum situation. We can all win.
Well, that's great to know.
Can I just jump in on that?
Sure, please. And I'll give you the last word, Melissa.
Thanks, I appreciate it. So I was just going to say, I think prefer referring to Fairness for All as more as a balanced approach to this rather than sort of a compromised approach. Because again, as a Christian, all of the components that are involved in the Fairness for All legislation are proponents that I espouse. We're not compromising our faith or our mission as a denomination in any way. And so I certainly think it's possible. I think we've had some really productive conversations, and I'm excited about the possibilities.
Well, I think that'll be the last word on that, but that actually leads into our segment too. Because we see all of these issues happening at a national level, of course it makes sense that we're going to start to see things happen on a local level as well. According to what I've been looking at, there's a piece of legislation that's in Arizona, and it's called Equity and Fairness for Arizonans. And it sounds like they are trying to do what I would call a mini version of Fairness for All or the Equality Act. But they're also running into some bumps and hurdles as well, trying to get through on that. Melissa, tell me a little bit about this particular piece of legislation and what's going on with it, and some of the strengths and the pitfalls that you may see coming.
Sure. Well, so as you mentioned, this piece of legislation that's just been introduced recently in Arizona takes a very similar approach to expanding civil rights protections for the LGBT and community. But again, it's taking a similar approach to Fairness for All, because it's also recognizing and acknowledging and not pushing against existing religious freedom protections. And to me, as someone that works in this arena, it's really encouraging, because this piece of legislation was introduced, crafted by an LGBT local, a state level LGBT rights group. And to me, I think that's really encouraging, because they're recognizing, again, what we just mentioned is it's not the zero-sum game. We can, look out for each other. And so to me, I'm really encouraged that this approach was taken rather than sort of the Equality Act approach in the state of Arizona.
Carmela, I just want to bring out to you, this is an issue that I think is so important, that there is this idea that if you are in a religious community, that you're really caught up in culture wars, and you're not really focusing on, let's call it the Matthew 25, where you are going out and looking out for the least of these. And if you have somebody who's actually being oppressed or taken advantage of, regardless of what their situation is, their sexual identity, or whatever the case may be, it seems as Christians, if we're going to be Christ-like, that you still have to take that in consideration, even in protecting our own points of view. Am I missing something on that, or what are your thoughts?
I don't think you're missing anything on that. And I also think that is not just a principle in the Christian community. That is one of the foundations of our democracy. We look out for the people whose voice is not as strong. We make sure that there are protections across the board. But hey, look, where did that come from? Where did that stem from? Those were the words of Jesus. You're looking out for the least of those. And so we have to be in a space where we can say, I have my beliefs. I am who I am, but I see you as a person. And I'm interested in who you are and what you want. And I'm interested in knowing what that is. We may not agree, but I'm interested in the person. And I'm interested in that person has a voice and has the basic things that they need in life. Like I sound like a broken record, but it's the same thing.
But I got to ask you, Jennifer, when you take a look at these issues, sometimes it's not that easy to jump on and support pieces of legislation, because sometimes they have some little nuances in there that can make one religious group a little bit uncomfortable. Anything going on in this Arizona legislation that may not be readily apparent upon the first reading, but when you get a little deeper into it, you can see how maybe you can't get all sides on the same page with this?
Sure. And I think that you raised a really important point, and that is you have to really get into the weeds of what is being said and what are some of the potentially unintended consequences of the way that certain legislation is written. So in this case, for example, the Arizona legislation talks about banning conversion therapy. And on its face, that sounds like a great thing. There have been many, a lot of documentation about conversion therapy being abused. And that is when a therapist is trying to change the sexual orientation of an individual. And sometimes they use means that could be classified in some cases as torture. But in the legislation, we have to keep in mind that there's a line between therapy and maybe pastoral counseling. And, so one thing that we want to make sure of, because I think that most of us would say, yes, conversion therapy as it's generally thought of is a bad thing. But when we get down to the nuances and into the weeds, we would never want to prevent a pastor from being able to give pastoral counseling based on biblical principles and that being labeled as conversion therapy and there being penalties applied to that. So we have to be very careful about how legislation is written and what some of the unintended consequences could be.
Bettina, do you see basically when we've got all of these state laws coming in place that we're going to find ourselves sometimes where you can be in one region of the country, and if you go across the street, you've got these set of rules as it relates to this, and then you go across the street, you got another set of rules. Isn't this going to get way too confusing, and folk are going to feel like, I better just stay home because I have no idea what's going on anywhere else? I mean, what do you think? Help me understand this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the patchwork approach exists in a number of other areas. I mean, you just think of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which applies only to federal actions. And so for it to apply at the state level, states have had to, in some situations, pass their own RFRA laws. And so you already have that in place where there's one set of rules in one area and another in another area. But, it goes back to our conversation in the first section of this show. We have the opportunity now at the federal level to deal with these issues in a very comprehensive way. And so this sort of patchwork approach at the state level, which while it is praiseworthy, while it's wonderful to see different groups coming together, being collaborators in policy making in these very, very difficult areas, let's not forget we need federal change. This is where it needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the issues, and this is probably one of the conversations that most people are uncomfortable with, is all religious groups don't see things the same way. I think there's this thought process that if you are Christian, you must all see it the same way. If you're a Muslim, you must all see it the same way. The question is, can we even get religious groups on the same page when it moves forward with this? Because that's probably what our political leaders are going to be looking for. Carmela, what are your thoughts? I mean, are we ever going to even see the religious groups kind of coming to the conclusion that, we generally can agree? Or are we going to probably see this battling back and forth going on for a while? What's your thoughts on that?
I sure hope you're not coming to me for optimism on these kinds of questions, because I don't believe that that's always going to be true. There are some things, and frankly, I don't know that agreement on all these fine points is the goal. What is the goal? And is the ends that are put out for the people who need it the most, right? So the religious groups, whatever, as a religious person or a woman of faith, I have certain things that I need or I believe in, but I'm not the person who is seeking protection. So I think the person who is seeking protection, we have to look at what do they need? I don't have time to make sure that I align with every other religious entity around me or other religious groups. I think it's good. I think it's something we should do, but I'm not going to hold my breath to see that that's going to happen.
Well, Carmela, I'm going to let you have the last word on that topic, and I don't think any of us are going to hold our breath to see the left and the right actually playing together nicely either. But let's go on to this next topic in segment 3. The Biden administration has been doing everything they can to really try to put in place policies and procedures to deal with COVID. One of the things that they chose to do was to create some mandates, and that there would be mandates regarding vaccines. And they thought that they would even put in place some policies as it relates to OSHA. And those OSHA policies were going to be impacting companies that had 100 employees and above. But then the Supreme Court comes in. They take a look at this, and they end up making their own decision regarding it. And now I can't tell if they tried to split the baby in half or we actually got more politics involved. Jennifer, can you help me understand exactly what was going on as it relates to vaccine mandates and that Supreme Court decision?
Sure. So there were actually 2 decisions that came out. One was dealing with the OSHA mandate that applied to employers with 100 or more employees. It was very broad. And then one was the CMS rule that applied to healthcare providers. And you're right, there's a little bit of the splitting of the baby there, in the sense the Supreme Court said that it was beyond OSHA's mandate, really, to be providing these regulations that were really public health measures on this very broad basis. And on the other hand, CMS, though, they did have the authority, because this is a public health measure and this falls within what they are, called to do under federal law. And so they said, oh, CMS, this is clearly within what you're able to do. OSHA, you've overstepped your bounds. So in one sense, we still have the mandate moving forward for healthcare providers, but we don't have this broader one that applies to all employers with more than 100 employees.
So Carmela, I got to ask you this. All cases going to the Supreme Court now, people are always talking about, we've got the liberal justices, we've got the conservative justices, and we saw a decision come here. Do you think these decisions were really liberal or conservative, or do you think it was actually a pretty balanced conversation as to how they got to where they got to on this?
Well, judging even from the conversation that Jennifer just provided in the background here, you're looking at this from a different framework. And I don't see that as necessarily, although I leave room for the fact that people's personal perspectives may be a part of their lens, part of it. But I don't see these coming down on the sense of, whether this is liberal or conservative or whatever their background or orientation. I think, the question of law is, where does this lie? Where does authority lie? And how do we interpret this under this? So, strangely enough, I'm not seeing that in this particular set of decisions. I could be wrong.
But Bettina, we always thought that everything that happens at the Supreme Court is either left or right. And I'll be honest with you, I'm one of these people who believe that this whole idea of you always picking a judge that you know what they're going to do doesn't really make any sense at all. But the reality is that something happened here with this case. And I'm just wondering, do we see that it can potentially be the beginning of something else as it relates to mandates? And we have some individuals saying that, the concept of a mandate in and of itself just feels un-American. What are your thoughts on that, Bettina?
Yeah, there is something very ironic about the Supreme Court donning masks and then saying that COVID is not a workplace hazard. It seems a little odd to me. But going back to your question, Orlin, I think it's important to note that what the court didn't say, and the court didn't say that employees can't be required to either vaccinate or test. They just said that OSHA couldn't require it under this particular statute.
Gotcha.
And so states can still require it in some situations. Congress, if it could get together to pass bipartisan legislation, it could mandate it. So the court was not ruling out the availability of a test or vaccinate mandate. It was simply saying that in this instance, the agency had overreached.
So, Melissa, we had an overreach that took place here with the Biden administration. They will tell you that they were just trying to do everything they could to move forward. But from a religious perspective, we always have to be cautious regarding overreaches and whether or not there were actually any religious exemptions that were going to be in place as it related to these OSHA rules. Did we see any religious exemptions that would have been helpful to us? And how do we keep our eye on the overreach from your perspective?
Sure, I think that's an important question. And yes, there were religious exemptions included in the OSHA mandate. I think another important thing to mention is that the federal government has gone back and is in the process of rewriting that rule, right? And so I think that's something for us as people of faith to pay attention to as far as what that actually, when the rule is re-released, what it will look like. And if it's something that makes sense, it likely will be challenged again, once again, when it's re-entered. But we also may be in a different space of society. We're currently seeing things opening back up as a society, precautions that are required, being made more optional. So who knows where this will end up?
I got to ask you, Jennifer, when these rules came out, as someone who's out there representing a world church and also activities that are happening locally in Washington, did you get the sense that this was an issue where even among church members, there was like this line in the sand that, we weren't all quote unquote on one accord. What have you been seeing even among the church members as it relates to these type of issues?
Yeah, so definitely we're not all on one accord on this. There are those within our church that do have concerns about vaccination mandates. There are those within our church who are very pro-vaccination mandates. So we represent society. And so we have diverse opinions on all sorts of issues, and mandating vaccinations is no different. That being said, our church does have official statements dealing with immunization that date years before COVID-19 was an issue, and the church has also reissued statements dealing with vaccination in the context of COVID-19. But while the church has a position, that does not in any way mean that individuals can't have their own positions that go beyond the teachings of the church. And the church respects individuals to have freedom of conscience in those matters.
Bettina, tell me a little bit about this freedom of conscience concept. This is an idea that it sounds like you as an individual have your religious beliefs that are protected based on what you believe, as opposed to being part of an organization. How do we kind of wrap that into this whole conversation we're having here with mandates and how we assist individuals?
Sure. There is a very broad misconception that for a religious exemption to be valid, it must be supported by the institutional teachings of a specific denomination. That is just, as a matter of law, incorrect. Individuals and their own convictions that are based on their religious faith, those are what are material in this instance. And so those are the factors that they need to put forward. They don't need to cite the specific denomination's dogma or theology relating to exemptions, to vaccines or to issues of conscience around vaccines.
I'm going to give you the last word on that, Bettina, but that's some great information that we need to be thinking about as we move forward and are trying to assist as many people as we can. So we're going to get to our final segment. We call it Tell Me What I Don't Know. And so I'd like for you guys to let me know something that I don't know. Melissa, I'm going to start with you. Tell me something I don't know.
Well, you probably do know this, but something that I thought was interesting was looking at the vaccine mandate requirements or ruling from the Supreme Court, and sort of, how, as you all said, two different rulings on the same quote unquote issue, and seeing which justices they were one was a 6-3 ruling, one was a 5-4. Chief Justice Roberts and then Justice Kavanaugh are the ones who sort of switched over to quote unquote a different side. And I think that the two judges are going to be people to pay attention to.
Good. Jennifer, take about 15 seconds and tell me something you don't know. I'm sorry, something I don't know. I'm sorry.
Again, I'm not sure how many people are following this, but even recently, there have been some articles that have come out to talk about the fact that most religious organizations, most faith organizations, that they're very hesitant about granting letters of exemption or supporting exemption letters on behalf of their employees. But I think that what we need to always keep in mind is something Bettina said, and that it doesn't really matter. This is about the individual. And so I want people to always be aware of that. Whether or not the church writes a letter on your behalf, you get to write a letter that states what your sincerely held religious belief is, not what your denomination's beliefs are.
Wow, appreciate that. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So I'm tired of talking about vaccines. I'm sorry. I'm going to talk about something else, and that's the January 6th committee in the House. And I'm watching that closely as it gets toward releasing its report. Most people think that if the Republicans retake the House after the midterms, that they will disband the committee. I'm making a prediction, Orlin, that they will, in fact, keep the committee going and will use the investigative powers of the committee to try to change the narrative that has been established by the current committee.
Wow. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, I think you know a lot more than I can even do it. But the one thing, like Bettina, I would like to go to a different topic is critical race theory. We talked about legislation being passed in Arizona. Well, it sure would be nice if the idea of critical race theory would be protected. You start messing with history, start denying what is history, or start labeling things as divisive as people share their truth. That is a slippery slope that people who are of conscience don't want to go down.
Wow, ladies, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a great show. And I just would like to thank our audience for being a part of Faith in Politics and look forward to seeing you in the coming future. And just remember, if it's about God and it's about government, it's Faith in Politics. See you next time.